I remember the exact moment I realized my life had changed forever, though at the time, I didn't fully understand it. Lying in the hospital bed, for pumping fluids into my veins, shivering under the thin hospital blanket, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if anyone else could understand what it was like to feel your body betray you every single day. Could someone really comprehend what it meant to wake up and not be able to eat, to barely drink water, to fight just to survive another morning? And then there was him, D, my partner for 3 years, the person I thought I could trust, who I thought would be there for me through anything. But as I lay there, nauseated beyond imagination, I realized he was becoming a stranger. And worse, I couldn't help but ask myself, was I going to have to face motherhood alone? It's terrifying, feeling the helplessness sink into every fiber of your being while your own body works against you. Hyperemesis gravidarum, they call it medical jargon for a kind of suffering no one can prepare you for. Morning sickness, they'll tell you. But if you think a little nausea, maybe a few days of vomiting, that's what I endured, you are wrong. Wrong in every sense. Imagine losing 50 pounds in a single trimester, surviving mostly on Jell-O, fluids, and the occasional forced sip of water, all while your partner, the person you shared your life with, grows distant with every passing day. That was my reality, and in that haze of sickness and uncertainty, I realized something else. I had to start making decisions not for him, not for us, but for the tiny life growing inside me. We had both agreed, at the beginning, that marriage wasn't necessary. 3 years together. No rings, no societal expectations, just us. We talked about love, about partnership, about supporting each other through everything life threw at us. And yet, when the first signs of struggle came, the real, terrifying struggle, he was only there sporadically. He drove me to there a couple of times, yes, but hospitals made him uncomfortable. And the rest of the time, he was absent. And I was too weak, too sick, too consumed by the fear of losing this child to even care about sending more than the occasional text. My mother became my lifeline. When I admitted I couldn't stay at our apartment, she welcomed me with open arms. Her house smelled of clean laundry and faint cinnamon from the candles she always lit. The smell of safety in a world that suddenly felt like it was closing in on me. She connected me to an up who understood the severity of my condition, helped me get on benefits, and reminded me that surviving wasn't weakness, it was strength. That's when I realized something crucial. Motherhood wasn't just a future idea. It was now. It demanded my attention, my care, my decisions. And if D wasn't going to be fully present, I would have to make the choices alone. By the second trimester, the fog of nausea finally began to lift. I could eat without immediate fear of vomiting. I could move without the constant spinning of the room. I began to feel like a person again. But in that fragile resurgence of life, I noticed the cracks in our relationship. D had become distant. Messages went unanswered for hours, sometimes days. When he did appear, it was mechanical, picking me up, dropping me off, accepting groceries I bought him with my newly approved debit card. We coexisted more than we connected. The intimacy, the partnership, the shared understanding of a life together, it felt gone. I remember the day we argued about the apartment like it was yesterday. I had asked him to tell me in advance when he wanted to rearrange our things and make room for the baby. I had my own schedule, my own sanity to maintain. And yet, he forgot. When the day came and I told him I already had plans, something in him snapped. Words were thrown like knives, accusations, frustration, and suddenly, 3 years of partnership crumbled in a single afternoon. It was messy, raw, and suffocating. By the end of it, our relationship had ended not with one final declaration, but with a series of small betrayals and disappointments that added up until there was nothing left. After the breakup, communication between us became strictly transactional. Conversations revolved around my belongings, our child, and logistics. Emotions had been stripped from our exchanges. He reminded me of the hyphenated last name we had once discussed for our baby, and I nodded without fully committing. Part of me wanted to believe he would be present, that he would be a father in the ways that mattered. But part of me, the part that had survived 50 pounds lost, our visits, and complete helplessness, began to doubt. Maybe I needed to protect our child in ways that extended beyond physical presence. Maybe a name could be the first step in safeguarding a future that I could no longer trust him to share. And then came the call from jail. The irony of hearing his voice, knowing he had been arrested over something minor, was almost surreal. The fact that he had a friend drive his car home, a friend whose identity he refused to reveal, made my stomach churn. And then the joke question I barely thought about whether he had a girlfriend. His response, casual, flippant, yeah, not months later. But during our brief, bitter separation, he had already moved on. 4 months into a relationship he claimed was understood from the start. 4 months of betrayal wrapped in excuses, rationalizations, and technicalities. He didn't cheat, he said, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. They echoed in my mind, a testament to the gap between promises and actions. I stopped contacting him beyond what was necessary. Labor approached, and I made the conscious choice not to inform him when I went into the hospital. I wanted peace, focus, and control over my own experience, the birth of my son, the first moments of life that were mine to protect. He arrived after the birth, spent an hour with his son, and left. It was brief, detached, and yet, in those moments, I realized the weight of decisions that were mine alone to carry. And when the paperwork arrived, when the birth certificate demanded a choice I could no longer leave to chance, I made it. My son would carry only my last name. It wasn't pettiness. It wasn't revenge. It was survival. It was foresight. It was the quiet rebellion against the possibility of abandonment. And though I knew this decision would spark conflict, anger, and claims of deprivation, I felt an unexpected clarity. I was no longer waiting, no longer hoping for a partner who had already moved on. I was a mother, alone, but unwavering, and I would protect my child with everything I had. The first weeks after bringing my son home were a blur of exhaustion, fear, and tiny, miraculous moments that made every second of suffering feel like it had been worth it. I stared at him sometimes for hours, tracing the curve of his cheek with my fingertip, marveling at how something so small could carry so much weight in my heart. The nights were the hardest. The cries, the feedings, the constant vigilance, they all built a rhythm I couldn't escape. And yet, through the haze of sleep deprivation, I felt a fierce clarity. I was his mother, and no one, not even D, would dictate what that meant. Visiting hours from D were minimal. 4 times in the first 4 months for brief, awkward encounters that left more tension than comfort. I watched him hold our child once, his fingers brushing the soft skin of the baby's hand, and I felt a strange mix of relief and anger. Relief that he cared in some small, physical way, anger that the emotional and logistical support I had needed during pregnancy had been absent. He showed up when convenient, when he could fit a few moments into his life without truly altering it. And still, in those brief moments, he claimed rights to a name, to a legacy that, in reality, he had barely begun to earn. The hyphenated last name we had discussed when things were simpler, when sickness hadn't reshaped our lives, now seemed almost laughable. The world had changed too quickly, unpredictably, and I had learned that relying on promises, especially from someone like D, was a dangerous gamble. I had loved him, truly, deeply, but love alone had not protected me from betrayal, from neglect, from the cruel twist of human selfishness. And in the quiet of the nursery, rocking my son to sleep, I realized that love alone would not protect him either. My choices had to. One evening, I found myself scrolling through social media while my son slept in his crib, my mind wandering to D and the news my friends had uncovered for months of dating someone else, hidden in plain sight. How do you reconcile that with the father of your child? How do you process someone's casual betrayal while holding a fragile, tiny human who depends entirely on you? The anger was sharp, but so was the clarity. I had to protect what mattered. I couldn't leave decisions about his identity, even something as seemingly small as a name, to someone who had already shown he might disappear. Wendy eventually returned to the hospital to sign the birth certificate. I remember the sharp tension in the air. His eyes, wide with disbelief and anger, locked on mine as he read the line where his last name was absent. "Charlotte," he said, voice tight. "Why did you do this? This isn't fair. He deserves both our names." I could see the disbelief written across his face, the shock that someone would, without hesitation, make a choice he didn't agree with. And for a moment, I hesitated, not because I doubted my decision, but because I remembered the hope I had once held, the trust I had invested in someone who had already proven he wasn't reliable. "I did it because I had to," I said, keeping my voice calm but steady. "I needed to make a choice that I knew was in his best interest. Not yours, not mine, his." My words hung in the sterile hospital air, mingling with the faint smell of antiseptic and baby powder. He argued, insisted, begged even, that I was being petty, that I was robbing him of something intrinsic. But I had long ago realized that names, legal papers, and rights were not abstract, they were shields. They were a way to ensure that, if D decided to walk away, our son would not carry the weight of abandonment in something as permanent as his own name. The days that followed were difficult, not because of paperwork or legal complications, but because of the silent, suffocating judgment of the outside world. Friends and family offered mixed advice. Some praised me, others questioned my decision. Could I have hyphenated the name and still protected my child? Maybe. But Dee's behavior had made one truth painfully clear. Promises meant nothing when weighed against consistent action. And I had learned, in the hardest way possible, to trust actions over words. I started documenting everything, not for revenge or confrontation, but for clarity. Each visit, each missed promise, each instance of disengagement was a recorded testament to the reality that my son's father might not always be present. Writing it down helped me make sense of the storm of emotions that constantly threatened to overwhelm me. Anger, sadness, guilt, relief all existed simultaneously. A chaotic symphony that only a mother in my position could understand. There were nights when I questioned myself, though. Did I go too far? Was I punishing D for choices he made outside of our relationship? Choices he hadn't made directly against me? Would our son grow up resenting me for taking away a connection he might have wanted with his father? The what-ifs gnawed at me in the quiet darkness. And yet, every time I saw my son's peaceful face as he slept, the weight of doubt lessened. I knew I had acted not out of anger or spite, but out of foresight and love. Friends often asked me if I felt guilty about the birth certificate. The truth is complicated. I felt a pang, a small flicker of remorse for breaking a prior agreement, but it was tempered by the overwhelming certainty that my choice had been right. D had made his priorities clear long before my son arrived. He had shown where his loyalty, his presence, and his dedication truly lay. And in that realization, I found a strange sort of empowerment or clarity that came only from surviving the unimaginable and protecting someone who could not protect themselves. Even now, almost a year later, I watch these sporadic visits with a detached concern. I hope he loves his son. I hope he grows into the kind of father our child deserves. But I also know that my son's identity, his foundation, rests in stability and presence, not in absent promises or fleeting declarations. Giving him my last name wasn't about excluding someone, it was about ensuring continuity, consistency, and love in a world that had already proven unpredictable and, at times, cruel. Sometimes, I imagine the conversations we'll have when our son is older. I picture him asking why he doesn't carry his father's name, why decisions were made the way they were. I will tell him the truth, not in bitterness, not in anger, but in honesty. I will tell him that life is complicated, that people make choices that aren't always fair, and that the most important thing we can do is protect those we love. That love is not just a word, it's action. And if there's one lesson I have learned through sickness, heartbreak, betrayal, and birth, it is this: protecting the people you love sometimes means making the hardest decisions, even when no one else understands. The first few months of being a mother alone are not for the faint of heart. Every decision felt amplified, every mistake felt monumental, and every moment of joy was tinged with exhaustion so deep it almost became a second heartbeat. I learned to read every little noise, the faint cough, the whimper, the sudden movement in the crib, as if my son was speaking a language only I could understand. And in a strange way, that constant vigilance became my sanctuary. It was proof I was here. I was present. I was fighting. And like D, who seemed to slip further and further away with every passing week, I was tethered to reality by sheer necessity. When D visited, it was like stepping into a fragile bubble of tension that could shatter at any moment. I remember one afternoon vividly. The sun streamed through the blinds in jagged lines, painting stripes across the living room floor. He held our son with the awkwardness of a man who had forgotten how to connect with a tiny human being. His eyes darted to mine, silently asking for approval, as if the hours of absence could be erased with a single visit. I forced a smile, but inside, a storm was brewing. How could someone who had been absent, who had already betrayed the fragile trust between us, now expect to step into this carefully constructed bubble of love and responsibility? The subtle reminders of betrayal haunted me in unexpected ways. The birth certificate, the paperwork, the legal documents, they weren't just bureaucratic necessities. They were symbols of a choice I had made in full awareness of risk. Giving my son only my last name was more than a name. It was armor. It was the declaration that, no matter what happened, he would carry the certainty of love and stability on the one hand and not the risk of abandonment on the other. Yet every time Dee spoke of legacy or my name, I felt the old pang of doubt. What if I had been too harsh? What if this decision would haunt him later? But then I reminded myself of the nights I spent fighting for my life, the hours of nausea, the weight of uncertainty, and I knew no one who had witnessed that, no one who had lived that, could question the protective instinct behind my choice. Friends would ask if I regretted not hyphenating the name. They would speculate. What if D changes? What if he becomes more present? My answer was always the same. I didn't make the choice for him. I made it for my son. Hypotheticals, however tempting, couldn't outweigh reality. D's absence, his indifference during my hardest months, and his willingness to move on so quickly, these weren't hypotheticals. They were facts, and facts, in my world now, carried far more weight than promises, excuses, or technicalities. Even the mundane moments became a battleground of emotions. Grocery shopping, diaper changes, doctor visits, they were all tinged with the awareness that every decision, every movement, had to account for my son's safety and well-being. I became hyper-aware of Dee's sporadic appearances, mentally tallying the impact of each visit. Would he bond with our child? Or would his fleeting presence leave only confusion and disappointment? Could a name truly matter in the grand scheme of attachment? Or was it a safeguard against a world that had already proven unpredictable? I wrestled with these questions constantly, often lying awake at night with my son finally asleep in my arms, staring at the ceiling and trying to untangle the web of emotions that motherhood, betrayal, and independence had woven. One particular evening stands out: the night my son had been unusually fussy and he had decided to drop by for an unexpected visit. The tension in the air was palpable. He came in, carrying a small toy, smiling nervously, as if the gesture alone could undo months of neglect. I watched him interact with our child, carefully observing his posture, his tone, the patience or lack thereof he brought into our home. For a fleeting moment, I almost felt relief. Maybe he could be a father, even now, imperfectly. But then I remembered the months before, the absent calls, the rests, the casual betrayal, and the illusion shattered. The tie, the smile, the perfunctory touch, none of it replaced the presence he had refused to offer when it truly mattered. And so, I retreated into my own rhythm. Nights became ours, mornings became ours, moments of discovery and firsts, the first laugh, the first steps, the first babble were ours, not his, not shared with the absent partner I had once loved. It was empowering and exhausting in equal measure. I learned to celebrate victories without acknowledgement, to find joy in isolation, and to forgive myself for decisions that, while necessary, carried the weight of another person's potential resentment. The whispers of doubt, however, never fully disappeared. Would my son resent me one day? Would he question why he didn't carry his father's name? Would he interpret my protective choices as rejection or malice? These thoughts haunted me, chasing me in the quiet hours, testing the limits of my resolve. And yet, every time I looked at his peaceful, trusting face, I knew my decisions, my actions, and my vigilance were justified. Love, I realized, wasn't just about presence or affection. It was about protection, foresight, and the courage to make the hard choices that others couldn't. Toward WOULD and single quotes T-make. Sometimes, when I catch glimpses of Dee's life online, his new relationships, his seemingly carefree days, I feel a flicker of anger, a reminder of the promises broken and trust betrayed. But it's fleeting, quickly replaced by gratitude. Gratitude that I survived, that I fought for my health, my life, and my child's future. Gratitude that in my own imperfect, exhausted, and painfully human way, I had made the choice to shield him from uncertainty, even if it meant standing alone. And that is the paradox of my story. The very thing that some might see as selfish, petty, or unforgiving is, in truth, the most profound act of love I have ever known. To act decisively, to protect, to place the welfare of another above the comfort of reconciliation or societal expectation. This is the quiet heroism of motherhood. And in the silent moments, when my son sleeps safely in my arms, I feel the immense weight of that heroism, a weight I bear willingly, knowing it is for him and no one else. The months stretched on, each one folding into the next like pages in a book I hadn't expected to write. My son's first year was a montage of milestones and near misses, of tiny hands curling round my fingers, and the soft gurgle of laughter that made every sleepless night, every hospital visit, every ounce of fear feel justified. But woven into these moments of tenderness was the persistent shadow of Dee's absence. His sporadic visits, though brief, cast long echoes over our daily lives, reminders that the man who had fathered my child existed outside our little cocoon. Unaccountable and unpredictable, I started noticing patterns subtle, but telling. Every visit seemed calculated, every smile measured, every interaction with our son cautious. It wasn't warmth or connection, it was a transaction, a fleeting presence that left me emotionally exhausted, but silently vigilant. And that name, the one I had inscribed on the birth certificate, became both a shield and a symbol. I would watch Dee glance at it during the occasional meeting, the brief court dates, the paperwork exchanges, and I could almost see the shock ripple through him, the disbelief that I had made a choice without his consent. Yet in my heart, there was no regret. I had chosen certainty over hope, reality over promises, and I knew that every sleepless night, every difficult decision, was worth it to protect my child from a world that could be cruel and inconsistent. One particularly cold winter morning, the kind that makes the air sting when it touches your skin, I found myself walking the thin line between fear and resolve. Our son had been crying relentlessly, teething, exhausted, frustrated, and I had spent hours trying to soothe him. In that quiet, snow-dusted morning, I realized the enormity of what I had done. I had, in effect, taken full control of my child's world, making irrevocable decisions in a landscape where trust had already been fractured. It was terrifying and empowering at the same time, like standing on the edge of a cliff and understanding that you had to leap to protect someone you loved more than yourself. Dee tried to argue once more. A month or two after the birth certificate had been signed, he called, anger threaded through his voice, accusing me of being petty, of stealing a right he supposedly deserved. I listened in silence for a moment, letting the words wash over me. Then I spoke, calmly, deliberately. This isn't about you. It's about him. If you want to be a father, you will find a way to show up, not just occasionally, not just when convenient. Our son doesn't need a legacy from someone who treats promises like suggestions. I could almost hear him deflate on the other end, the fight draining out of him, because he knew deep down that I wasn't arguing from emotion or impulse. I was arguing from truth, from experience, from a place that no one else could access, but a mother fiercely determined to protect her child. I started noticing subtle changes in myself during this period, shifts I hadn't anticipated. The rage and hurt, though ever present, had transformed into something sharper, something like clarity. I was learning to navigate a world where betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was logistical, legal, and practical. Every decision, every action had to be calculated. My son's welfare depended on my foresight, and with every diaper change, every doctor visit, every sleepless night, I realized that I was growing into a kind of strength I hadn't known I possessed. Yet, for all the clarity, doubt still lingered. I wondered if I had been too rigid, too decisive, too quick to make permanent choices. Would my son resent me someday? Would he feel the absence of a father's name like a missing piece of his identity? The what-ifs were persistent, gnawing at the edges of my mind in the quiet moments, when exhaustion blurred with introspection. But then, I'd look at his small, trusting face, the way his eyes lit up when he recognized me, and I would remember the decisions I made were not born of anger or revenge. They were born of necessity, of protection, of love that demanded action. I also began to notice the subtle social dynamics, the whispered judgments, the well-meaning advice, the pointed questions from family and friends. Are you sure? They ask. Wouldn't it be better to hyphenate, to give him a chance? And each time, I would respond with a quiet firmness. I'm sure. I have to make decisions based on reality, not possibility. I have to protect him from what I know, not what I hoped for. And while these words often left the questioners unsettled, they also became a mantra I repeated to myself during moments of fear and exhaustion. Reality, I realized, was the only compass I could trust. There were nights, though, when solitude became suffocating. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had been too harsh, if I had acted prematurely. Memories of Dee's sporadic presence and flippant betrayal replayed relentlessly, like a film I couldn't pause. And yet, in the darkness, I also felt the tiny warmth of my son curled against me, his breath soft against my chest, reminding me why I had made the choices I had. Protection, above all else, had become my guiding principle. And slowly, as days turned to weeks and weeks to months, I began to realize that this principle wasn't just about shielding him from Dee. It was about cultivating a world where my son could grow knowing that love meant action, consistency, and sacrifice. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it confirmed my strength and my ability to navigate motherhood alone. Terrifying because it underscored the enormity of responsibility I had assumed. The consequences of a single decision made in the chaos of a hospital room months before. And yet, as I watched my son take his first steps, giggle at a toy, reach out for my hand, I felt an undeniable sense of purpose. I had made a choice that was hard, perhaps even controversial, but it was unequivocally right. Even now, as I reflect on those early months, I understand the complexity of my decisions. Choosing my last name for my son was more than a matter of identity. It was a declaration of protection, an assertion of foresight, a quiet act of defiance against a world that could be unreliable, unpredictable, and cruel. And though the path I walked was lonely and fraught with judgment, it was also a path of empowerment, clarity, and unconditional love. The first birthday came quietly, almost unceremoniously, yet it carried a weight I hadn't expected. Balloons, a small cake, tiny hands smeared with frosting. I watched all of it with a sense of pride that surprised me. Each moment felt like a victory, not because it was grand, but because it was ours, because we had survived, because in a year that had begun with uncertainty, fear, and betrayal, we had carved out a space that belonged solely to the two of us. And yet, even in these moments of triumph, the shadow of Dee lingered, subtle but persistent, like a cold wind brushing against the warmth I had fought so hard to create. I remember the call he made that morning, asking if he could visit. I paused, holding the phone in my hand, considering whether to let him into the space I had meticulously nurtured. Could I allow someone who had been so absent, so inconsistent, to be part of this milestone? Could I risk reopening the doors to uncertainty, confusion, and hurt? After a moment of silence, I responded, "He's going to have a quiet day with family, but we'll see each other another time." The decision wasn't easy, but it was deliberate. My son's emotional safety was more important than my desire to appease anyone else, even his father. It was in these moments of quiet defiance that I began to truly understand the weight of the choice I had made. When I wrote only my last name on his birth certificate, it wasn't about excluding Dee entirely. It was about establishing a foundation that could withstand absence, betrayal, and the unpredictable chaos of human behavior. It was about ensuring that the first identity my son would know, the one he would grow up recognizing, repeating, and embracing, was grounded in stability, love, and unwavering commitment. And if Dee wished to be part of his life, he would need to earn it through consistency, presence, and genuine investment, not through fleeting gestures or empty promises. Yet, even as I found strength in my decisions, doubt remained an unwelcome companion. I wondered how our son would perceive the gaps in his father's presence, how he would interpret the absence of a hyphenated name, and whether he might one day question the choices I had made. The questions were relentless, gnawing at me in the quiet hours, but they also forced me to confront a truth I had long understood. Parenthood is messy, unpredictable, and fraught with moral ambiguity. The decisions that matter most are rarely simple, and the consequences are often invisible until much later. One day, as I watched my son play with blocks, I realized something profound. Identity is more than a name. It is formed in the cradle of love, in the consistency of care, in the unspoken assurances that someone will always be there. A hyphen, a surname, a legal document, they are markers, yes, but they are not the essence of belonging. What matters is presence, protection, and unwavering commitment in that moment. The lingering shadow of Dee's absence became less a source of anxiety and more a stark reminder of the reality I had navigated to protect my child. There were, of course, moments when I caught myself replaying the what-ifs. What if Dee had changed? What if he had been more present during pregnancy? What if I had hyphenated the name, trusting that he would rise to the occasion? The hypotheticals were endless, but each time I felt their weight, I reminded myself of the facts. The facts were that he had moved on quickly, neglected my needs during my most vulnerable moments, and treated promises with the casual disregard of someone who didn't fully grasp the gravity of his ISIS. And in that stark clarity, I found reassurance. My actions were justified, deliberate, and protective. The world, of course, had opinions. Family members, friends, even casual acquaintances offered advice, speculation, or judgment. Maybe you should reconsider, they'd say. He might step up now that the baby is here. And each time, I smiled politely, but internally, I shook my head. Reality is rarely shaped by hope alone. It is shaped by observation, experience, and the courage to make difficult decisions in the absence of certainty. I had learned, through the crucible of sickness, betrayal, and motherhood, that hope without evidence can be dangerous, and that protective action, even when misunderstood, is a form of courage. And so, I continued. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. I documented milestones, recorded visits, and carefully monitored every interaction between Dee and our son, not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. Every detail mattered, every choice mattered, every absence mattered, and through it all, I noticed a transformation within myself, a resilience, a quiet ferocity, a deepening understanding of what it meant to protect another human being. My son had become both my responsibility and my teacher, showing me the raw, unfiltered power of love and the necessity of decisiveness. I also noticed a subtle but powerful shift in Dee's demeanor. The occasional arguments about the name, the sporadic visits, the thinly veiled frustration, these became predictable patterns. He wanted recognition, affirmation, and control, but not the consistent effort required to be a true partner or father. And in recognizing this, I realized that the choice I had made to give our son only my last name was not only protective, but symbolic. It was a statement of ownership over our child's well-being, a declaration that I would not gamble his identity on promises that had already been broken. As I reflect now, nearly a year later, I understand that my journey is far from over. The questions will persist. The doubts will linger. And Dee's presence or absence will continue to shape our experiences. But I also understand something more important. Motherhood is not defined by the absence of challenges, betrayal, or uncertainty. It is defined by the choices we make in the face of those challenges, by the love we act upon, and by the courage to protect the vulnerable even when it is uncomfortable, lonely, or misunderstood. And so I continue, each day a testament to resilience, protection, and unwavering love. Each night, as I watch my son sleep, I whisper a silent promise: I will protect him, guide him, and love him unconditionally. No absent parent, no betrayal, and no societal expectation will change that. I have made the hard choices, and I will continue to make them, because love real, enduring love is not passive, it is action, and in the end, the action is what shapes identity, secures safety, and builds the foundation upon which a child can grow, thrive, and flourish. By the time our son was approaching a year old, the patterns of absence and presence had settled into a rhythm I could almost predict, yet the tension never fully dissipated. Every interaction with D felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon of emotion. One misstep, one word too sharp, and the fragile piece of our small family bubble could shatter. I had grown skilled at navigating the strain, reading the subtlest cues in his voice, in his body language, in his half-hearted attempts to bond with our child. Every fleeting smile or awkward gesture was measured, cataloged, and stored for reflection. It wasn't paranoia, it was strategy. The real challenge, however, was managing the invisible tension within myself. I oscillated constantly between guilt, anger, and clarity. Did I overstep? Had I been too decisive in giving our son only my last name? Would he grow up resenting me for decisions I made out of necessity, not malice? These questions gnawed at the edges of my mind, uninvited, persistent, yet in the quiet moments when my son curled into my chest after a long day. When his small hand grasped mine for comfort, I found reassurance. I had acted from love, from foresight, from the recognition that life does not always offer the luxury of waiting for others to catch up. Then came a day that would test every ounce of patience, courage, and clarity I had developed. D had called, unusually insistent, requesting an extended visit. He wanted to take our son out, to spend hours together, promising attention, care, and affection. My first instinct was skepticism. Patterns, I reminded myself. Actions reveal character far more than words ever could. I asked myself, would this be another fleeting, performative display, or had something truly shifted? The visit arrived, tense from the start. D seemed to oscillate between forced enthusiasm and subtle impatience. His every gesture calculated. He tried to engage, to show interest, but the effort felt mechanical, and yet there were moments, small flashes of genuine connection, fleeting smiles, brief laughs that made me hesitate. Could he change? Could he grow into the father I had hoped for when we first discovered I was pregnant? I pushed the thought away, reminding myself of the larger picture. Consistency, reliability, and true presence matter far more than temporary displays. As the afternoon unfolded, a minor incident tested the balance I had worked so hard to maintain. Our son, overwhelmed and tired, began to cry inconsolably, the kind of wail that pierces through exhaustion and patience alike. D froze, unsure of how to respond, his hands hovering awkwardly as if afraid to make a wrong move. My instinct took over. I stepped forward, calming our son with practiced gestures and soft words. I felt a mixture of triumph and sorrow. Triumph for knowing how to navigate the situation. Sorrow for the stark realization that this man, the father of my child, had missed countless opportunities to develop these instincts naturally. After he left, I sat in the quiet of the living room, watching the fading light of the evening spill across the floorboards. The weight of the day pressed on me, heavy with reflection. I realized that the decision to give my son only my last name was no longer just about paperwork, it was a symbolic line in the sand. It represented foresight, protection, and a refusal to gamble on promises that had already proven unreliable. It was an act of quiet defiance against abandonment, a statement that love is not merely emotion, but action. Yet even in clarity, doubt lingered like a shadow. I wondered how this choice might shape our son's perception of his father, how it might influence the delicate balance between curiosity and confusion, between longing and resentment. Parenthood, I realized, is not a series of perfect choices. It is a series of informed, deliberate decisions made in the absence of certainty. And sometimes, those decisions are lonely, isolating, and misunderstood. In the weeks that followed, I noticed subtle shifts. These visits became increasingly sporadic, each one shorter than the last. The attempts at bonding that had once been clumsy now felt performative, almost rehearsed. I began to see the truth with unflinching clarity. He was not prepared, emotionally or practically, to meet the demands of fatherhood, and in recognizing this, I felt a mix of sorrow and vindication. Sorrow for the lost potential, for the fractured family we could have been. Vindication in knowing that my protective choice, the last name, had shielded my son from uncertainty, from the instability I had already witnessed firsthand. There were moments, though, when my resolve was tested in unexpected ways. Friends, well-meaning and curious, asked pointed questions. Do you think he'll ever step up? Would it have been better to hyphenate? What if he wants to reconnect when your son is older? Each query, while innocent in intent, stirred a subtle turmoil within me, and each time I returned to the same truth. Love, when genuine, manifests in action. Not words. Presence matters more than promises. Commitment matters more than legacy. And the choices I had made, however controversial, were grounded in this reality. One evening, as I tucked our son into bed, I realized that motherhood had transformed me in ways I had never anticipated. The fear, the anger, the doubt, they had coalesced into something stronger. Vigilance, clarity, and unwavering devotion. I understood now that the decisions I make will forever shape not just our lives, but the foundation of identity, trust, and resilience I am building for my child. And the name on the birth certificate, once a source of contention, had become a quiet symbol of protection, a beacon of certainty in a world that had already proven unreliable. As I sat there, watching him drift into sleep, I felt a mix of exhaustion, pride, and bittersweet clarity. The journey had been harrowing, full of betrayals, heartbreak, and sleepless nights. But through it all, one truth remained unshaken. I had acted from love, foresight, and protection. The world may question, judge, or misunderstand. You may feel anger, frustration, or a sense of loss. But the most important person in this story, my son, would grow up safe, loved, and grounded in certainty. And in that, I found an unshakable peace, the kind of clarity that only comes from surviving the unimaginable and choosing decisively for the ones you love. By the time our son's first birthday passed, I felt a shift within myself I hadn't anticipated. The exhaustion of early motherhood, the constant vigilance, and the emotional roller coaster of navigating Dee's sporadic presence had forged me into someone I barely recognized, but in the best way. I was stronger, more decisive, and more attuned to what truly mattered, the well-being and emotional security of the little human who had changed my life forever. The birthday itself was quiet. Just a few close friends and family, laughter spilling through our small living room, balloons hovering in the air, and the scent of cake sweetening the moment. Our son, oblivious to the complexities of adult relationships, giggled and grabbed at the colorful decorations. Watching him, I realized that all the fear, all the sleepless nights, and all the difficult decisions had been worth it. He didn't care about names, legacy, or legal battles. He only knew love, presence, and security. And I had given him that, fully, fiercely, and without compromise, decalled, as he sometimes did, asking about the celebration, asking if he could come by for a visit. I paused, feeling the old knot of anxiety and resentment in my stomach, but I also felt clarity, a serenity that came from having faced uncertainty, betrayal, and doubt before and emerged stronger. I told him gently, but firmly, we had a small family gathering. Another time, no anger, no recrimination, just quiet boundaries, a demonstration of what I had learned. Love is not about appeasing others. It is about protecting those who depend on you. Looking back, I realized the true weight of the decisions I had made. Giving my son only my last name wasn't an act of spite or malice. It was an act of protection, a safeguard against the unpredictability of a man who had already proven he could abandon promises. It was a declaration that his identity, his foundation, and his sense of security mattered more than someone else's fleeting sense of entitlement. And in that, I found not only vindication but peace. Motherhood had taught me lessons I hadn't expected, that love is action, not words. That protection sometimes requires difficult, unpopular choices, and that the courage to act decisively can shape a life for the better, even when others don't understand. I had learned to trust my instincts, to observe actions over words, and to prioritize the person who mattered most to my son. Every challenge, every betrayal, every sleepless night had contributed to a clarity that I could never have achieved any other way. Now, almost a year later, as I watch my son play, laugh, and grow, I feel a deep sense of satisfaction and hope. Our life is not perfect, but it is grounded, loving, and secure. Dee's sporadic presence is just that, sporadic. And that is okay. The decisions I made were never about excluding him entirely. They were about ensuring my son's life had a steady, safe, and nurturing foundation, one that would not be shaken by absence, inconsistency, or betrayal. And so I sit here, reflecting on the journey, understanding fully the emotional and moral complexity of my choices. Some may see my actions as rigid or overly cautious. Others may empathize, recognizing the courage it takes to make hard decisions for someone else's well-being. But the truth remains. I did what I had to do. I acted out of love, protection, and foresight. And in doing so, I created a world where my son can thrive, free from the uncertainty that once loomed over us. Now, I ask you, the listener, what would you do in my situation? Would you prioritize promises over proven actions? Would you risk a child's stability on hope alone? Or would you act decisively to protect them, even if it meant defying expectations, agreements, or societal norms? Comment below with your thoughts. Share your experiences, your doubts, and your own hard choices. And if you want to hear more gripping, real-life confessions of love, betrayal, and resilience, subscribe to follow the journey, because at the end of the day, motherhood and parenting in general is about courage, clarity, and the relentless pursuit of what's best for the ones we love. And that, above all else, is a story worth telling.